Edward Hamilton never thought for a single minute that destiny would bring him face to face with the one person he had completely left behind, all because he was chasing the big life. He couldn't sleep one night, felt restless, and suddenly needed a bite to eat, which landed him in a super-fancy Manhattan restaurant. That place was loaded with expensive art and snobby waiters, but Edward didn't even notice. He was used to all that fluff. Then he looked up, and the world stopped dead. He saw her clear across the room. Sarah Mitchell, his best friend from childhood. She was a waitress now, leaning over, looking tired, just trying to keep up with the demands of her tough life. In that one shocking moment, their two completely different worlds smashed right into each other, starting a drama neither of them ever saw coming. Edward Hamilton had always been the kid with stars in his eyes back in the little quiet town of Amberfield, Pennsylvania. When he was just a boy, he used to perch on the old, wobbly fence in his grandparents' yard, staring up at the dark sky and picturing a future way bigger than that simple street. It was right there, when he was only 10 years old, that he promised himself one thing. He would get powerful. He would get loaded with money, enough to make sure he and the people he cared about never had to worry again. The expensive aroma of truffle oil and vintage Bordeaux was suddenly irrelevant. The meticulously curated atmosphere of Ilana's, a setting designed to signify Edward's ascendancy, shattered into meaningless noise. Across the room, Sarah looked thinner than he remembered, the effortless brightness that once defined her replaced by a disciplined, almost defensive efficiency. She moved with the weary grace of someone perpetually compensating for a system rigged against them. Edward felt the old promise, forged under the Amberfield oak tree, turn into a sharp, physical ache beneath the Italian wool of his suit jacket. Enough money to ensure they never worried again. That vow now mocked him from the distance separating their tables. He, the master of market stability, felt a sudden, profound instability in his own perfectly tailored reality. He stood, not bothering to inform the dinner party he was hosting, who continued their discussion about derivatives as if the gravitational pull of the Earth had not just shifted. Sarah, mid-pivot between the bar and table 7, paused when she saw him. Not the startled gasp of recognition one might expect from a reunion after 15 years, but a tightening around her mouth, a behavioral mask instantly deployed. It was the look of a professional recognizing a complication, not a friend recognizing history. "Edward," she said, her voice low, practiced, lacking the musical lilt he remembered. "You're in the wrong zip code." "Maybe I am," he replied, closing the physical gap between them. His gaze lingered on the strain visible around her eyes, a testament to late nights and early mornings. 5 minutes. Out of here. Now. Sarah instinctively checked the clock mounted above the kitchen door. "I'm covering the second shift, Hamilton. I don't have 5 minutes. I'll speak to the owner, or I'll buy the restaurant, whichever takes less time." The threat was delivered flatly, devoid of malice, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of his Manhattan power. She studied him then, really studied the man who wore the kind of wealth that insulated him from the common struggle. She didn't flinch. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm due back here in 35 minutes for my break. There's a place across the street. The Corner Bistro. Terrible coffee. Decent quiet." He nodded, accepting the boundary she immediately established. She was not asking for help, nor was she submitting to his command. She was offering a logistical compromise. This quiet assertion of control was precisely what had always anchored Sarah. The Corner Bistro was a functional antithesis to Ilana's. Where Ilana's was velvet and subdued lighting, the bistro was linoleum, fluorescent tubes, and the insistent hiss of the steam wand. The change of scenery magnified the contrast between them. Edward, radiating effortless expense, looked like an ambassador from a foreign, inaccessible country, while Sarah, now stripped of her uniform apron, was simply tired resilience personified. They sat in a corner booth. The air was thick with the history they had abandoned, the shared summers and whispered confessions under that ancient oak tree. "So," Edward started, resting his hands on the Formica table, a conscious effort to avoid fidgeting with the heavy gold watch on his wrist. "Tell me everything I've missed." Sarah stirred her subpar coffee with excessive attention. "The abridged version? I finished high school. Worked 2 jobs to pay the rent after high school. Moved to the city 4 years ago. Ended up here." She gestured vaguely at the steam and noise. "It's temporary. Saving up. Going back to school this fall." "Teaching," Edward stated, the memory immediately solid and clear. "You always wanted to teach history." A faint, genuine smile touched her lips, the first unforced expression he had seen since he walked into Ilana's. "History? Yeah. I'm pre-enrolled at NYU for the fall cohort. Just need to finalize a few things." He leaned forward, dropping the polished facade. This was the opening he sought. "Finalize what, Sarah? If it's financial, that's easily—" "Stop," she cut him off, her voice still quiet, but carrying the force of a slammed door. Her eyes met his, and the vulnerability that usually defined his interactions with the city's elite was replaced by a familiar stubbornness. "I know who you are now, Edward, and I know what that means. We don't need to do the rescue routine." Understated dialogue and behavioral emotion. The tension wasn't in shouted arguments, but in the careful parsing of language, the avoidance of direct conflict. "It's not a rescue," Edward insisted, immediately shifting his body language to appear less imposing. "It's a correction. I left Amberfield to get out. I got out. I did it, frankly, by leaving you behind. We were partners then, remember? We were supposed to—" He stopped himself from invoking the oak tree oath. "We were 10, Edward," she said softly, but her tone was firm. "And you didn't leave me behind. You pursued your destiny. I pursued mine. They just turned out to be different avenues." He absorbed the subtle indictment. His avenues were paved with gold. Hers were worn, requiring constant maintenance. "So, what is the avenue looking like right now?" he pressed. "You said you needed to finalize things." "Oh, what's the hurdle, really?" She took a slow, deep breath, pulling her defenses tighter. "It's logistical and expensive. Tuition is manageable with loans and grants. But I'm moving into a heavier course load, which means I have to cut my waitressing hours drastically. I need stability for about 18 months. This was the surface explanation. Edward's analytical mind immediately registered the missing data points. Sarah was fiercely independent, yet she was discussing moving into heavier course load territory, which typically meant she had secured her primary obstacle. Why the visible fatigue, the strained professional mask? "And the stability involves?" he prompted, maintaining a neutral expression. Sarah hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the window, watching the blur of Manhattan's ceaseless flow. Parallel action. Outside, a wealthy couple laughed as they stepped into a black car. Inside, Sarah debated revealing the fissures in her foundations. It involves covering a few, let's call them, inherited obligations, she eventually admitted, her voice dropping lower, almost a confession to the Formica. "Things that came up recently. Unexpectedly heavy costs that are not directly tied to my own decisions, but which I am legally responsible for clearing before I can truly focus on school." The guarded phrasing, the sudden aversion of her eyes, confirmed Edward's rising suspicion. This was not about covering rent or utility bills. This sounded like a legal encumbrance, a hidden levy on her future. "Inherited obligations," Edward repeated, the phrase tasting acidic. "Are we talking about your father?" Sarah flinched, a small, barely perceptible movement of her shoulder. Behavioral emotion. The flinch spoke volumes about the pain point. Robert Mitchell, Sarah's absent and troubled parent, had always been a source of anxiety. And now, it appeared, financial distress. "He's been unwell," Sarah said, the evasion palpable and complicated. "Look, Edward, I truly appreciate the concern, but I need to handle this. It's my life, my mess. I wanted to see you. I did. But I didn't want this meeting to turn into a consultation." Edward, the highly calculating financier, knew how to interpret silence and deflection. Sarah was fighting a battle that required more than the meager wages of a waitress. She was fighting a systemic problem. His guilt, previously abstract and historical, now gained immediate, actionable clarity. He saw the thread connecting his own desperate ambition to escape poverty and Sarah's current, quiet desperation to merely achieve stability. The ghost of Amberfield financial strain had followed her to Manhattan. "Fine," Edward conceded, raising his hands in a gesture of retreat, though his mind was already constructing scenarios, running risk assessments. "No consultation. Just a favor. Let me at least structure your educational plan. I can connect you with people who handle student financing, grants, endowments, people who ensure that once you quit your job, that decision is irrevocable. A safety net, entirely separate from any personal funds, that allows you to start your degree without the physical stress I see on your face right now." He deliberately phrased the offer as logistics, not charity. He knew her pride too well. Sarah watched him, weighing the proposition. A safety net. A strategic partner, perhaps, but one who demanded nothing in return beyond the easing of his own conscience. "It would have to be an agreement," she stipulated, finally meeting his gaze, her fierce independence reasserted. "No handouts. A loan, secured against future earnings, meticulously tracked, and you get no oversight of my course choices or my personal life. We meet once a month for coffee, and you get an update on my progress. Nothing more." Edward offered a slight, almost imperceptible smile. This was the Sarah he remembered, setting the terms, demanding accountability, even when accepting help. "Deal," he confirmed. "Email me the contact information for these inherited obligations you mentioned. I need to understand the terrain before I build the structure." She hesitated one last time, rubbing her thumb against the rim of her coffee cup. The weight of her secret, of the legal and financial burden her father had placed on her shoulders, seemed momentarily too heavy. The truth was, she had no structure. The debt was immense, tied up in fraudulent loans her father had secured using her identity, and she was already facing threats that felt far too real to be dismissed as routine creditor aggression. "I can't do that yet," she admitted, her gaze dropping again. "The obligations are currently escalating. They aren't standard credit card bills, Edward. They require serious legal intervention, not just a repayment plan. If I give you the details now, you will try to fix it, and I need to try to fix it myself first." Edward's heart hammered against his ribs. Escalating. Serious legal intervention. This was worse than he had feared. The simple waitress job was not just temporary employment. It was a desperate bulwark against an unseen, crushing financial tide. "Sarah," Edward began, his voice edged with controlled concern, but she was already rising, pulling the apron back on. 35 minutes are up," she said, her professional mask firmly back in place. "I have table 11 waiting. Email me. We'll schedule the next coffee. And please," she added, her eyes locking onto his one last time, "do not show up at Ilana's again. It complicates my tips." She walked away, crossing the street and disappearing into the sophisticated glow of Ilana's. Edward remained, staring at the empty linoleum booth. He hadn't seen vulnerability in her words, but in the rapid, panicked escalation of the timeline she had just revealed. If her financial difficulties were serious enough to be escalating, he knew, with chilling certainty, that her plan to handle it alone was destined for failure. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He needed data, legal context, and immediate financial modeling. He couldn't just stand by while she fought a sophisticated legal fight with minimum wage tips. Edward sent a terse, coded message to his chief legal counsel, a man specialized in restructuring and corporate debt, simply stating, "Personal matter. Urgent triage required. Locate all known financial entanglements, historical and current, of Robert Mitchell and Sarah Mitchell, Amberfield, PA. Priority Alpha. A situation is actively deteriorating." The urgency of the threat, the unknown scope of her father's damage, filled the quiet corner of the bistro. Edward was no longer just the hedge fund CEO. He was the 10-year-old boy under the oak tree, realizing that the forces he sought to escape were now menacing the one person he had sworn to protect. He had achieved all the power and wealth he desired, yet Sarah was still fighting the same ghost of financial ruin that haunted their youth. He needed to act before her silent, escalating crisis swallowed her whole. The silence of Edward's penthouse felt less like peace and more like the vacuum before an implosion. He had abandoned the polished veneer of the bistro for the cold, uncompromising glass and steel of his 45th floor office, where the city sprawled beneath them, a silent, glittering map of transactions and consequence. The secured transmission from his counsel, Maxwell, arrived less than an hour later, cutting through the tense quiet like a razor. It wasn't a neat summary, it was a deluge. Edward didn't merely read the document, he experienced it as a tidal wave of digitized ruin. Sarah stood a respectful distance away, leaning against a cool marble column, attempting to occupy herself with the distant glow of the Queensborough Bridge. She kept her hands clasped, a gesture of enforced stillness meant to keep the panic tethered. Edward stared at the screen, the highly redacted report unfolding a story far uglier than simple neglect. Robert Mitchell hadn't taken out a single bad loan. He had constructed a fragile, parasitic ecosystem of debt. It was a baroque labyrinth of paper shadows, straw borrower agreements, undisclosed equity draws against properties he never fully owned, and several complex, high-interest fractional loans tied to businesses that existed only as digital entries in offshore registries. The language of the report, willful fraudulent misrepresentation, shell entities utilized for asset shielding, potential collateral exposure including personal identification theft, was the dialect of his world, but applied to Sarah, it tasted like poison. He felt the metaphorical description of the threat settle deep in his gut. This wasn't a hole she had fallen into, it was quicksand masquerading as solid ground. Every time she tried to push up, the systemic nature of the fraud pulled her further under, threatening not just her immediate funds, but her future eligibility for basic necessities, student loans, housing, even specific teaching certifications that required pristine financial histories. The initial number Sarah had quoted, a sum that had felt crippling to her, was merely the visible tip of the iceberg. The real exposure, the total liabilities intertwined with her name, vaulted upward, easily exceeding 6 figures. It was a figure that would take the average working person decades to repay, even without the crushing interest rates now accumulating like venom. Edward's movements became fragmented, sharp, and focused purely on the screen. He ignored the exquisite espresso Maxwell had delivered, instead seizing the steel pen on his desk and slamming it down next to the tablet. "Maxwell, confirm the jurisdictional scope," Edward muttered into the secure line, his voice a low, furious rumble. "Is this contained to Pennsylvania, or did Mitchell cast a wider net?" The delayed reply echoed, dry and unsettling. We are tracing linkages now, Mr. Hamilton. Preliminary assessment suggests connections in 3 states, possibly utilizing a centralized, unregulated lending pool. This is not casual debt. This is organized preying. The projected emotion of Edward's internal rage solidified into a cold, protective barrier. He hadn't just been invited to pay a bill. He had been recruited into a high-stakes, cross-state litigation effort that threatened Sarah's very identity. He questioned the adequacy of his own shield. He had built his fortune to fight institutional forces, but personal, familial betrayal was an entirely different kind of rot. His internal conflict flared. Could all the money in Manhattan undo this kind of systemic damage without completely obliterating her sense of self-reliance? Sarah, sensing the shift in the atmosphere from distressed urgency to something far colder and more technical, finally approached the desk. Her expression was pale but determined. "Edward," she started, her voice low, a determined insistence woven into the syllables. "I appreciate what you're doing, but please, tell me what the total is. I need a clear number, so I can start calculating. If I pick up double shifts for the next 6 months and maybe take a loan against my car—" Edward's hand shot up, cutting her off mid-sentence. His eyes, usually cool and calculating, burned with a sharp, uncompromising light. A light that wasn't directed at her, but at the enemy represented on the screen. It was interrupted dialogue, not out of disrespect, but out of necessity. "Stop." The word was not a request. "You will not take double shifts. You will not calculate. You will not take any further action regarding the repayment of anything, Sarah. Do you understand?" She blinked, startled by the sheer force of his command. "I understand the urgency, but I need to pull my weight, Edward. I am capable of earning my way out of this." "This isn't weight you can pull," Edward stated, leaning back, the sheer magnitude of the situation making his body rigid. "This is a structural collapse. Your father didn't just borrow money. He made you legally liable for a series of interlocking, fraudulent ventures that are tied up with entities specializing in preying on unsecured, desperate debtors. If you try to pay off the visible debt, you acknowledge liability for the entire web. We are not just clearing your name. We are dismantling a fortress of legal entrapment built on your signature." He looked at her then, seeing the flash of terror behind the pride in her eyes. The sheer scale of the legal complication, hundreds of thousands of dollars, coupled with the threat of severe, long-term credit and legal implications, was now irrevocably clear. It was a threat that transcended simple cash flow and invaded the realm of future possibility. He took a slow, deep breath, regaining the cool composure that shielded the hedge fund CEO from the 10-year-old boy. The doubt about his ability to fix this vanished, replaced by a granite determination despite the profound adversity. "We will not use a checkbook to solve this," Edward finalized, his voice now level and authoritative. "We will use lawyers, forensic accountants, and every regulatory loophole I know exists. You are enrolled in school next month. You will quit the bistro by the end of the week. Your job now is to focus on your future. My job is to eradicate this past." The air in the conference room on the 55th floor of the Hamilton Group Tower was pressurized, tasting faintly of ozone and expensive leather. It was a space designed for decisions that moved millions, not for deciphering personal tragedy. Yet here they sat. Edward stood at the head of a massive oval table crafted from polished obsidian, the Manhattan skyline glaring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sarah, pale but resolute, sat beside him, surrounded by stacks of financial documents that dwarfed her. Edward had mobilized his inner sanctum, Lawrence Sterling, a white-haired predatory litigator whose hourly rate could fund a small community college, and Dr. Anya Cho, the lead forensic accountant, whose eyes, hidden behind thick black frames, seemed capable of dissecting the very molecular structure of deceit. "The objective remains the same, gentlemen," Edward stated, his voice a low, precise instrument cutting through the sterile silence. "We are not paying this principal, nor are we accepting the long-term liability. We are proving fraudulent inducement and negligence on the part of the lending institution. Dr. Cho, what does the paper trail say about the offshore holding in Nevis?" Dr. Cho adjusted her glasses, tapping a thick sheaf of papers. "The initial loan, the $185,000 tranche, was channeled through a series of 4 holding companies, each dissolving within 90 days of the transaction. Textbook money laundering obfuscation, Mr. Hamilton. However, the complexity here suggests the involvement of someone far more sophisticated than Mr. Mitchell's documented financial despair." Sarah flinched. The confirmation that her father was not simply incompetent, but perhaps a pawn in a larger, darker game, stung with unexpected sharpness. This wasn't just debt. It was entanglement. "The new complication," Sterling interjected, his voice gravelly, "is the secondary mortgage taken out against Ms. Mitchell's future earnings, the alleged collateral. It's a derivative instrument structured to mature exactly when Ms. Mitchell would hypothetically graduate and begin earning a teacher's salary. It's predatory, yes, but legally sound on paper, assuming the signature is authentic." "It's not," Sarah whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the obsidian table. "I never signed anything remotely like that. I barely knew what a mortgage was 6 months ago." Sterling offered a grim, professional smile. "We have 3 separate forensic handwriting analyses disputing the authenticity, but the bank's legal team is prepared to argue implied consent, given the power of attorney Mr. Mitchell held. To win, we need to prove complicity on the part of the lender, not just fraudulent use by your father. That requires a depth of discovery this institution is resisting." The cost of this operation, Edward knew, was exponential. Sterling and Cho were meant to be focused on securing the Hamilton Group's acquisition of a major tech conglomerate, a multi-billion-dollar deal scheduled to close in 8 weeks. Diverting their full attention and the corresponding operational infrastructure meant that Edward was effectively putting the success of his quarter, and potentially his firm's internal reputation, on ice. This was not a checkbook solution. This was a complete professional sacrifice. "Focus the entire legal division's bandwidth on securing a motion to compel discovery," Edward commanded, his gaze hard, focusing the combined 500 years of experience in the room. "I want every email, every internal memo, every contact between Robert Mitchell and anyone affiliated with that loan department. If we find proof they were aware of his history of financial instability, we break the chain of culpability." Edward wasn't just investing money. He was deploying the full weight of his influence and the institutional resources he had spent 10 years building. This was an extraordinary effort, far beyond the scope of mere friendship. Days bled into a relentless cycle of strategy meetings and data analysis. Sarah had taken Edward's instruction to heart. She quit the bistro, shedding the heavy, perpetual anxiety that came with balancing trays and concealing debt. She began her teaching preparatory coursework, but the weight of the legal battle pressed down, making concentration elusive. One late evening, Edward found Sarah perched on a stool in the marble kitchen of his penthouse, surrounded not by textbooks, but by the same intimidating loan documents. She was nursing a glass of water, her shoulders hunched. "You should be sleeping," he said softly, walking in. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, the sharp angles of his face deepened by fatigue. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since they started this. "I can't," she admitted, looking up, her eyes wide with unspent emotion. "I keep looking at this, and I realize the depth of the trouble I brought to your door. Sterling mentioned today that they are filing a motion to delay the tech acquisition. Because of me." The guilt was explicit in her tone, heavy and self-flagellating. Edward crossed the space and leaned against the counter beside her. "Sarah, listen to me. This isn't trouble. This is a fight. And the Hamilton Group is built to fight. Sterling is doing what he's paid to do. Insulate us. The acquisition delay is a tactical necessity, not a sacrifice." He reached out and gently took the sheaf of documents from her hands, placing them out of sight. "Your job is simple. Remove the past from your mind. Focus on the future you deserve. My ambition has always been to master systems. Right now, this is the system I am mastering. You are not a burden." "But the cost. The cost of not doing this," Edward interrupted, leaning closer so their proximity became a shield, "is letting the transactional greed of the world win. That is the one outcome I cannot tolerate." His own emotional shield was lowered, revealing the 10-year-old boy from Amberfield who hated the arbitrary cruelty of poverty. He wasn't doing this just for her. He was battling the ghost of his own past vulnerability. 2 weeks into the intensive legal assault, the resistance from the lending institution hardened significantly. They successfully delayed the motion to compel discovery, citing protection of proprietary lending models. Sterling was furious. The delay bought the opposition precious time. Edward convened a crisis meeting, not in the conference room, but in his personal office, the walls lined with financial awards and modern art. He had exhausted the standard legal playbook. "They are stonewalling Edward," Sterling stated, running a hand through his thin hair. "They know if we get the internal communications, we nail the collusion. We need leverage outside the court system." Edward turned toward the expansive window, his reflection superimposed over the glistening towers of Midtown. He knew exactly what Sterling meant. They needed to pull a lever of influence so powerful that it bypassed the legal bureaucracy entirely. A favor, a debt called in. He thought of Senator Wallace, the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, who owed Edward a massive, unspoken favor stemming from a discreet bailout of the senator's son's disastrous real estate venture 3 years prior. Wallace had promised Edward anything, anytime. Calling in this favor now would spend that currency entirely, possibly burning a crucial future political connection. This was the true, deep sacrifice. Edward looked back at Sarah, who was watching him with wide, understanding eyes. She seemed to sense the immense, unseen weight of the decision resting on his shoulders. He retrieved his phone, his movements measured and deliberate. "Draft a brief, airtight summary of the fraud and the evidence of institutional negligence," Edward instructed Sterling, his voice flat. "Highlight the potential for a massive class action suit against the bank for predatory lending targeted at vulnerable, high-risk groups. Use hyperbole. I need talking points that sound like a political scandal." Sterling's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the shift in strategy. "You're calling in the senator?" "Yes. We are moving this from a corporate skirmish to a regulatory firestorm," Edward confirmed, dialing the private, unlisted number he held for Wallace. He stepped out onto the attached balcony, the cold autumn wind whipping around him, carrying the sounds of the city far below. Sarah watched him through the glass. She saw him inhale slowly, then place the phone to his ear. "Senator Wallace," Edward began, his voice dropping into the smooth, professional cadence he reserved for high-stakes negotiation. "Edward Hamilton, I need to cash in that marker we discussed 3 years ago. Yes, the full marker. I have a situation that requires immediate, discreet regulatory investigation into the lending practices of First Central Trust." He paused, listening to the senator's cautious response, his jaw clenching slightly. "No, Senator. This isn't about the Hamilton Group. This is personal. And if you handle this with the necessary speed and discretion, neither your committee nor your son's past indiscretions will ever be mentioned in the same sentence." But if First Central continues to stonewall my legal team, I will personally ensure the scope of the resulting investigation is so wide that it makes the last housing crisis look like petty theft. He didn't wait for a response, delivering the threat with the cold, hard assurance of someone who always delivered. I expect the investigation to be opened by the close of business tomorrow. Thank you, Senator. Edward ended the call and walked back inside, radiating cold, exhausted power. He had just burned his most valuable political chip, diverting a massive professional resource to resolve a deeply personal crisis. The weight of that decision settled heavily on the room. "The leverage is deployed," Edward announced, looking directly at Sarah, whose face was a mask of awe and apprehension. "Now, we wait. If Wallace delivers, we get the documents and we crush their defense. If he hesitates, or if the political cost is too high, the bank may double down, sensing our desperation." He ran a tired hand across his forehead. Everything was now contingent on a promise made in darkness years ago. The relief that they had found a path forward was immediately choked by the intense uncertainty of the outcome and the immense, irreversible professional risk he had just shouldered on her behalf. They had fought the legal battle, and now they were deep in the regulatory war. The atmosphere in Edward's penthouse felt less like a home and more like an observation deck during a storm. The glass walls offered a dazzling, indifferent view of Manhattan, a million flickering ambitions below. Yet none mattered as much as the agonizing pause of their current legal purgatory. Sarah sat curled on the expensive leather sofa, radiating a stillness that belied the turbulence churning beneath her skin. Her posture was taut, her hands clasped tightly enough that her knuckles were white, a physical manifestation of her fierce independence battling the stark reality of her dependency on Edward's world. She was trying to memorize every detail of the anxiety, the scent of polished wood, the low hum of the advanced climate control system, the way Edward paced the length of the room, his stride precise, yet edged with an unprecedented vulnerability. Edward was a man built for control, for navigating the complex topography of global finance with ruthless efficiency. Watching him now, stripped of his usual impenetrable composure, was almost as frightening as the debt itself. His exhaustion was not just physical. It was the weariness of a man who had staked his entire foundation, his professional untouchability, on an emotional outcome. He had leveraged stability for vulnerability. Hours bled into the next morning, marked only by the shifting quality of the city light outside. They spoke mostly in fragments, indirect dialogue necessitated by the gravity of the unknown. Sarah asked if he regretted the risk. Edward responded with a curt summary of his philosophy. Regrets were liabilities, and he dealt only in calculated risks and decisive actions, though his eyes betrayed the unusual depth of this particular calculus. The silence was eventually shattered, not by a sound, but by a sudden, sharp vibration. Edward stopped mid-pace, pulling the secured satellite phone from his jacket. The name flashing on the screen, Wallace, was the single most important variable in their equation. Edward took the call in the adjoining study, closing the massive oak door, but the sudden absolute silence in the main room was louder than any conversation could have been. Sarah remained frozen, listening to the silence, her focus so intense that she could feel the pulse beating hard against her ribs, pushing against the constraint of her clasped hands. She could track the trajectory of the conversation through the low cadence of Edward's voice, the shifts in his tone. Initially, the tone was guarded, purely transactional. Then, a subtle easing, a shift toward acceptance. Finally, a note of grim finality, the sound of a professional deal closing, regardless of the emotional cost. When Edward emerged, he did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just paid an invisible, irreparable price. "It is resolved," he announced. his voice flat, drained of the cold power it had radiated the night before. Sarah's breath hitched, a sudden, ragged gasp of release that felt like a painful internal injury. She unfurled her hands, flexing her fingers as if they had been asleep for a week. Edward summarized the action with clinical detachment. Wallace, true to the promise made years ago, a promise now repaid at an immense cost, had moved with decisive speed. The documentation proving the fraudulent nature of the loan agreements, specifically the deep systemic failure in the bank's internal verification process, had been delivered to the regulatory body under extreme political duress. The summary was concise. The bank, facing the immediate threat of a catastrophic regulatory review that would jeopardize several lucrative governmental contracts Edward knew they desperately needed, folded. The fraudulent debt was being zeroed out. The immediate crisis was neutralized. Sarah stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. The weight that had been pressing down on her chest for months, suffocating her dreams and dignity, had instantly vanished. Yet, the physical feeling that replaced it was not joy, but a chilling emptiness. "What was the cost?" she asked, the question delivered in a low, steady voice that masked the tremor she felt internally. She was focused intensely on Edward, observing the minute tightness around his eyes, the slight slump of his shoulders. She knew the magnitude of the favor he had called in. In Edward's world, nothing was ever free. Edward dismissed the inquiry with a casual wave of his hand, a gesture of vast, almost insulting indifference. It was necessary leverage, a political marker. He tried to summarize the issue as merely transactional, a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of his hedge fund operations. He explained, using careful, indirect language, that he would have to spend the next 6 months strategically maneuvering to rebuild the goodwill he had just obliterated, emphasizing that the professional consequence was his burden alone. But Sarah was not fooled. Her moral center, forged in the heat of self-reliance and the painful struggle for financial independence, recoiled violently from his cavalier attitude toward such profound sacrifice. She saw not a resolution, but a terrifying display of disproportionate power wielded entirely on her behalf. "No, Edward," she countered, stepping closer, her voice gaining texture and heat. Her physical emotion manifested as a rigid posture, her arms crossing defensively over her chest. "That debt was my burden, my father's choices, my reality. You just incinerated a year of your professional life, perhaps more, using power that I don't understand and can't repay. You did it without asking, without giving me a choice on how to fight." This was the confrontation she had avoided since she learned the extent of the debt. It was not about the money itself. It was about the fundamental clash of their two worlds. Edward saw the problem as mathematical, a figure to be cancelled out. Sarah saw it as existential, a fight for her agency. Edward's own exhaustion morphed into defensive frustration. He summarized his internal motivation. He was trying to protect her, to prevent her from being destroyed by a malicious external force. He argued, his tone rising slightly, that her pride was dangerously misplaced, a romantic notion that had nearly cost her everything, including her future. He laid out the inescapable logic. Without his immediate intervention, she would have been financially ruined for decades, her teaching dreams crushed under the weight of the fraudulent loans. "What was the alternative?" Edward demanded, stepping closer, forcing her to confront the realism he lived by. He recounted the legal summary, the slow, humiliating attrition of bankruptcy, the public degradation, the death of her dreams. "I removed the obstacle. It is done." Sarah felt a surge of cold fury, the physical sensation akin to ice water being poured over her back. She did not argue the facts of the financial ruin. She argued the method of deliverance. She summarized her fear, that by accepting this rescue, massive and instantaneous. She was sacrificing the very independence she fought for. She explained that she did not want to be a trophy wife shielded by an impregnable wall of wealth, unable to fight her own battles. Her voice cracked slightly, admitting that his power was so overwhelming that it made her own efforts, her waitressing, her saving, her planning, feel utterly meaningless, childish even. "You didn't just save me from the debt, Edward," she articulated, gesturing broadly around the impeccably designed apartment, the symbol of everything she both admired and mistrusted about his success. "You saved me by proving that my entire concept of self-reliance is irrelevant when measured against your resources. You fixed a life-ending problem with a phone call. That is terrifying." Edward listened, the initial defensiveness slowly dissolving, replaced by genuine, pained understanding. He began to summarize his own motivation, the deep-seated fear of lack that drove him. He revealed, indirectly, that his impulse to solve her problem instantly stemmed from his own childhood trauma. The paralyzing shame and helplessness he felt watching his own parents struggle, his father's slow descent into financial recklessness. He admitted that, for him, wealth was not about luxury. It was about absolute defense against chaos. He wanted Sarah to feel the same immunity he had fought so hard to achieve. "I am not trying to own you, Sarah," he insisted, moving forward to take her hands. But she held herself rigid, maintaining the emotional distance. He summarized his deep-seated feeling. He wanted them to be a partnership of equals, but he knew the battle she faced was unfair, rigged against her. He saw his intervention as leveling the field, not dominating it. The climax reached its sharpest point when Sarah finally articulated the one condition she needed to move forward. She looked him directly in the eye, her resolve hardening. She summarized her demand. The debt might be gone, but the path she had started on, the hard-won goal of self-sufficiency, must continue. She needed to prove to herself, not to him, that she could build her future on her own merit. "I cannot just move into this life, Edward," she stated, her focus sharp and absolute. "I need to quit waitressing. Yes, but the money, the opportunity, the structure, it must lead me to finish my degree. I accept your help, but it cannot be a gift. It has to be an investment in my future, managed so that I am still the principal agent in my own success." She needed the framework, the legal aid, the security, but she refused the cushion of unlimited, passive wealth. She needed the structure to enable her dream, not replace it. Edward stood silently for a long moment, assimilating the full weight of her moral and emotional stipulation. It was a condition that demanded he curb his most primal instinct, the need to control and completely stabilize the situation through overwhelming financial force. It meant accepting a degree of shared vulnerability and ceding control over the management of her personal trajectory. He took a slow, deep breath, the physical effort visible in the slight expansion of his tailored suit jacket. He had won the legal and regulatory war, achieving an undeniable victory against the bank, but now he faced a far more complex negotiation, one based on pride, love, and respect. "A managed structure," Edward repeated slowly, summarizing the core concept. He summarized the professional requirements of such a setup: a formalized agreement, a scheduled withdrawal for tuition and living expenses, clear benchmarks for her academic progress. He had fought hard for this outcome, burned his leverage for this freedom, and now he had to accept that the freedom was hers to define. He nodded, a gesture of concession and profound respect. The stiffness left Sarah's stance just slightly, a subtle easing of the tension in her shoulders. The immediate conflict was over, the parameters of their future redefined not by Edward's wealth, but by Sarah's dignity. The immediate victory felt highly uncertain. They had cleared the major financial hurdle, but the emotional chasm of their different value systems remained wide, temporarily bridged by this fragile, newly agreed-upon compromise structure. They had only just begun to understand the true cost of combining Manhattan ambition with Amberfield morality. The agreement, codified less by printed contracts and more by the fierce, unspoken covenant of their combined wills, enacted immediate, profound changes. The pace of Sarah's life accelerated, yet the stress lines around her eyes paradoxically began to soften. She swapped the humid, frenetic energy of the restaurant kitchen for the sterile quiet of Edward's home library, a space previously reserved for complex portfolio analyses and high-stakes calls. The library itself became the first arena of their new, paralleled existence. Edward, seated at his imported mahogany desk, navigated the choppy waters of global securities, his fingers drumming out urgent commands on the keyboard. Across the room, occupying a reclaimed antique armchair, Sarah was submerged in foundational texts on educational psychology and classroom management. The contrast was stark. One world measured profit margins and risk vectors, the other measured pedagogical effectiveness and human potential. Their subtended dialogue revolved around necessity, not emotion. "The first payment for the courses has cleared," Edward stated one evening, his eyes still locked on the scrolling ticker tape of the Bloomberg terminal. The statement, a procedural confirmation. It was his way of saying, "I am upholding my side of the structure. Are you upholding yours?" Sarah didn't look up from her annotated copy of Dewey. "I secured the student ID and access to the online resources this morning. Orientation is Tuesday." Her tone was level, purely informational. It was her way of responding. "I require no micromanagement. I am achieving this on my own terms." Their parallel actions defined the new stability. Edward handled the relentless, high-decibel crises of the finance world with ruthless efficiency. Sarah dealt with the high-stakes, quiet bureaucracy of academic enrollment and the overwhelming demand of accelerated study. Both were fighting against chaos, but Edward's chaos wore $1,000 suits and manipulated derivatives, while Sarah's wore the weight of history books and the challenge of compressed time. Edward observed the evolution of her routine with clinical fascination, filtering his own profound relief through purely behavioral emotion. He noticed she woke up at 5 o'clock, earlier than even he did, dedicating 2 intensive hours to reading before the city fully woke. Her notes were color-coded, meticulous, and organized into binders that smelled faintly of fresh paper and determination, the antithesis of the crumpled server pads she had discarded just weeks prior. The most tangible evidence of their shifting dynamic was the disappearance of the protective wall Edward had built around their shared finances. He wasn't tracking the small disbursements for textbooks or bus fare. The structure worked. He had given her the framework, and she was building the house herself. This realization brought a wave of contentment, quickly followed by a peculiar sense of loss. The loss of the need to fight for her. The loss of the crisis that had bound them so tightly. One evening, Sarah spent 4 hours attempting to parse a dense philosophical treatise. She rubbed the bridge of her nose, pushing her glasses up, frustration etched in the slight furrow of her brow. Edward, momentarily distracted from a collapsing Asian market, watched her. "Difficult section?" he inquired, his voice low, stepping away from the desk. Sarah sighed, the sound thin and tired, but devoid of self-pity. "It's not the complexity. It's the time. I need 3 more hours in the day, Edward. I still feel like I'm running just to stand still." He knew that feeling. He lived that feeling every second the market was open. "You are making rapid progress. This isn't a rush to the finish line, Sarah. It's an investment." "I know," she replied, her gaze meeting his, the green flecks in her eyes sparking with a familiar intensity. But I cannot waste the breathing room you created. I won't. This was the core of her morality, and the challenge he accepted. Her acceptance of his help was not permission for leisure, but a mandate for accelerated self-reliance. The first month under the compromise structure passed in this disciplined blur. Sarah mastered the commuting routes to the campus, navigating the urban landscape Edward had long taken for granted. Edward, conversely, began to integrate Sarah's new schedule into his own, subtly shifting meetings to accommodate her study breaks, though he never commented on the adjustments. Their relationship was becoming functional, predictable, and deeply respectful, yet the luxury and excess of Edward's life remained an external pressing force, an unresolved element demanding integration. The unavoidable clash arrived in the form of a heavily embossed invitation to the Caldwell Foundation Gala, an annual, aggressively public display of wealth that Edward, as a major donor, was obliged to attend. It was the same milieu where Christine Caldwell had previously attempted to humiliate Sarah. Edward approached the subject carefully, recognizing the inherent contrastive description of the event versus Sarah's reality. "The Caldwell Gala is next Friday," Edward said, leaning against the doorframe of the library. "It's unavoidable. A significant portion of my firm's visibility requires attendance." Sarah closed her textbook slowly, setting it down with deliberate finality. The prospect of re-entering that social strata, no longer as the struggling waitress, but as Edward Hamilton's associate, still living under the framework of his structured provision, brought a flicker of old vulnerability to her expression. "Am I going as your date, or as your obligation?" she asked, the subtended dialogue emphasizing her fear of being perceived as an object or a project. Edward understood the question immediately. He pushed off the doorframe, crossing the plush rug to stand before her. "You are going as the woman who just scored 89% on her first midterm exam, the one who runs the two hardest races simultaneously, academia and independence, and refuses to lose either," he corrected gently. His hand reached out, not to reassure, but to simply rest a moment on the spine of her most used textbook. "You are going because you belong where you choose to stand, Sarah. That night, I need you to stand beside me, not because of what I own, but because of who you are becoming." The emotional weight of his quiet faith settled the matter. The stiffness in her shoulders returned for a brief moment, then relaxed, signifying her acceptance and determination. The challenge was no longer the debt or the structure. The challenge was confronting the superficiality of Edward's world with the genuine core of her Amberfield morality. She had achieved financial stability and academic purpose. Now she had to navigate social integration without compromising her soul. "Fine," Sarah confirmed, a steeliness entering her tone. She didn't dwell on the logistics of the dress or the inevitable encounters with the Christines of Manhattan. Her focus was singular, her mind already moving past the gala and back to the reading list. "But the next morning, I have a mandatory study group. We leave early." Edward nodded, a familiar surge of protective pride warming him. The compromise held. They had successfully transitioned from saving her independence to building their partnership. The foundation was set, fragile and new, ready for the ultimate construction. The Manhattan night was a black velvet canvas, stretched taut and stitched with the cold, electric glitter of wealth. Edward watched Sarah move through the gilded rooms of the Caldwell Foundation Gala, a required penance for their negotiated stability. She was a single, fierce flame amidst a sea of controlled, crystalline ice. Her dress, a sheath of midnight blue, was expensive, a gift he'd insisted on, but she wore it with the unaffected ease of a borrowed uniform, not a declaration of ownership. He caught fragments of her movement, small, telling actions that marked the finality of her transformation. A refusal to meet the eyes of a particularly oily philanthropist, a quiet, shared joke with a political aide who seemed genuinely interested in her future studies, the almost imperceptible tilt of her chin when a known gossip approached. Edward recognized Christine Caldwell immediately. She moved through the crowd like a sleek, calculating shark, the practiced smile affixed to her face. She saw Sarah, and the gleam in her eyes hardened, calculating the angle of attack, the precise social cut required to restore the natural hierarchy Christine believed in. Edward tensed, ready to intercede, but Sarah didn't need him. Christine glided closer, offering a passive-aggressive compliment about Sarah's sudden upward mobility. Sarah met the barb head-on. Her expression remained politely unyielding, a small, genuine smile offered not as a surrender, but as a statement of fact. "It's amazing what focus can achieve," Sarah stated, her eyes locking onto Christine's calculating gaze. Her voice carried the pure, unwavering core of Amberfield granite. She didn't bother to ask how Christine was, or apologize for her presence. The exchange was a transaction already concluded, and Sarah had already moved on. The action was fragmented, over in 30 seconds, yet it was the most definitive victory of the evening. Sarah hadn't merely survived the encounter, she had nullified it, using her achieved purpose, her education, her dignity, as an impenetrable shield. Later, leaning against a towering, useless marble pillar while sipping sparkling water, Sarah whispered, "That was suffocating." Edward merely squeezed her hand, a profound relief washing over him. "We leave in 20 minutes, just as promised." "Good," she murmured. "I have 200 pages of early American philosophy calling my name." The compromise held, not because of a contractual agreement, but because the external pressures of Edward's world had failed to penetrate the integrity they had built together. Sarah's commitment to her new life was absolute, anchored in the daily reality of textbooks and lectures, not the fleeting illusion of a Manhattan ballroom. Weeks spun into a rhythm defined less by the market's relentless volatility and more by the steady, satisfying cadence of Sarah's academic calendar. The financial world, the great swirling typhoon that had consumed Edward's identity for 2 decades, began to settle into a manageable wind at his back. Edward's life, once a taut, obsessive cable of acquisition, began to unwind. He found himself rearranging essential global calls to align with her study breaks, not because she ever demanded it, but because the echoing silence of his penthouse during her absence was too profound, too reminiscent of the isolation he had pursued in the name of success. He learned the geography of her new world, the damp smell of old books in the university library, the particular intensity of a graduate student reviewing notes, the exhaustion that came not from waiting tables, but from intellectual pursuit. This exhaustion was different. It was the proud fatigue of creation, of future building. He reflected on the financial documents, the monstrous shadow of Robert Mitchell's fraudulent debt, now reduced to a series of meticulous, routine transfers handled by his legal team, a problem neutralized. It wasn't the money that mattered. It was the mechanism of redemption it had facilitated. He hadn't bought her freedom. He had provided the scaffolding for her to build it herself, stone by self-reliant stone. Sarah, too, experienced a quiet, internal transformation. The brittle defensiveness born from financial precarity softened, replaced by a robust confidence. She was no longer balancing tips and tuition fees. She was studying curriculum theory and history, building the future she had envisioned since she was a child, sitting beneath the sprawling oak tree in Amberfield. The past, once a haunting shadow of debt and parental failure, became an honored foundation, a reminder of the resilience forged in hardship. Their apartment, Edward's apartment, slowly becoming their shared space, was a study in projected emotion. Edward's side remained minimalist, severe, dominated by screens flashing stock data. Sarah's side was a burst of organized chaos, annotated texts, stacks of pedagogical journals, and, surprisingly, a small, thriving indoor herb garden that smelled faintly of rosemary and earth, a tangible piece of Amberfield roots allowed to flourish in the urban steel. Edward recognized the shift in his own architecture. The towering, defensive wall he had built around his emotions, the one designed to shield him forever from the humiliation of his own impoverished youth, had crumbled, not violently, but piece by piece, excavated by Sarah's unwavering honesty and the simple, persistent warmth of their shared mornings. The anxiety that had driven his ambition, the deep, existential fear of ending up like his father, James, financially ruined and emotionally estranged, had quieted. He saw that true stability was not measured in zeros on a balance sheet, but in the certainty of the person next to him. Sarah was the ultimate stability, the quiet, moral center he had always searched for, disguised initially as a struggling waitress in a high-end restaurant. The loneliness that had defined his Manhattan life evaporated like morning mist under the sun. It wasn't just Sarah's presence. It was the shared purpose. They were building something real, rooted in mutual respect, a structure far more enduring than any hedge fund or skyscraper. The world of Amberfield was no longer a place of nostalgic guilt, nor was Manhattan solely a fortress of transactional necessity. They had integrated both, creating a unique equilibrium. One brisk afternoon in late autumn, Edward found himself near Riverside Park. The Hudson River, a deep, restless artery of water, flowed endlessly beside the green expanse, the sight reminding him of timeless commitment, of roots running deep beneath the city concrete. He carried the small velvet box inside his jacket pocket. Its weight was negligible, yet it felt heavier than any corporate acquisition he had ever finalized. It was not an investment, nor a structure of defense, but the clearest promise he had ever made. He knew the proposal would not be about rescuing her, or even about sharing his wealth. It would be about choosing permanence, about defining their future, not by the ambition that drove him away, but by the genuine connection that brought him home. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Sarah's name. The arc was complete. The financier had found his foundation. The weary student had found her future. All that remained was the formal declaration of partnership. The great construction was ready for its cornerstone.